Okay. 2 Samuel 18, we started talking about this a little bit last week, mostly in how David arranged the army. We saw it was led by Joab and Abishai and Ittai. Ittai was kind of notable for being at least a little newer to the group, if probably not a brand new soldier. But remember that all this is in the greater narrative arc of Absalom's rebellion against David. And so far, Absalom's been pretty successful. He has seized control there in Jerusalem, and he is coming for David, wants to kill him, and a great battle is about to happen. So, what is the outcome of that battle? Yeah, Lisa. Yeah. Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, so Joab, we noted last week that David wanted them to be gentle with Absalom. He did not want Absalom dead. How realistic that is, I don't know. Joab certainly doesn't seem very motivated to follow that instruction. Regardless, it is probably his duty to do what his king is telling him to do, right? But no, he's not very motivated to go along with that. Even before we get into the whole thing with Absalom, though, just the battle itself. What happens in the battle itself? Yeah. And that's kind of interesting wording to say Israel is defeated. Why that wording? Isn't David king of Israel? Yeah, okay, so, I mean, you can say that certainly from just the fact that most of Israel is following Absalom, and so if anyone is going to represent Israel, it is probably Absalom at this point. Mark?
Yeah, it's the same wording when Abner makes his push out of the key. Israel is following this other person.
Yes.
So that marks the narrative moving forward, that there's Israel and Judah, this great division from the beginning.
Yeah. Right. So kind of who the majority is following, that's probably the best explanation for that here. The other thing for us to watch out for, it's probably not as relevant right at this exact moment, but is throughout the Old Testament, is that the names Judah, Israel, and Ephraim have somewhat variable meaning depending on where you are reading. So Judah can refer to the tribe of Judah, right? One of the 12 tribes. It also can refer to generally the southern part of the country, including Judah and Benjamin and, maybe sometimes some of the others, but usually just Judah and Benjamin. It, of course, more formally refers to the split kingdom, the southern split kingdom, after Rehoboam and Jeroboam kind of take those separate sides. And then Judah in the New Testament is kind of used more generically just for, even Israel, right? So then with the name Israel, that can mean the nation as a whole when they are feeling pretty united, which is not always. It can mean the northern tribes in particular, whether you mean formally after the split, when they have 10 tribes that are separated and are their own country of Israel, or even just kind of generically the northern part of the country that's separate from the southern part of the country in Judah. And then the same kind of thing with Ephraim. Ephraim can be the tribe of Ephraim, or it can stand for the northern grouping as kind of the most prominent part of that region. All of this is mildly confusing because the idea of them being a united nation is in flux. Think of a time where, if you know your U.S. history, right? I think I've used this example, where the question was, are we a country or are we a collection of states? Right? That used to be a really big deal, that the states felt very separate from each other, and you had little to no federal government that was over any of it. Even now, culturally, and sometimes legally and politically, there are differences in the states. And we can be very different from each other while technically united under the same flag. So you have a lot of that going on with Israel as well, that they are sometimes referred to as this united nation, and sometimes they feel very splintered and separate from each other. Lisa, did you have something to add to that? No, okay. Yeah, okay. So that's kind of what's going on. You just have to understand context when you see these terms, although probably the best answer here is what was mentioned, that the majority of the nation is following Absalom at this point. So if somebody represents him, or represents them, it's him. Yeah.
I just found it interesting that, and I don't think I ever paid attention to this, but that day before it's like more people at the store.
Yeah.
Before it's at Easter.
Right. I find that interesting as well. And I struggle to know, and Lisa's referring there to verse 8, chapter 18, verse 8, it says, the battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. I don't even know exactly what that is referring to, other than you've got a lot of casualties that are not directly at the hands of the enemy soldiers, right? That you have people who are falling somehow. I don't know what is so treacherous about this forest here, other than maybe there's some working of God in giving David victory, and things are just not going well for Absalom. In its strict military terms, Absalom should win this battle. He's got way more soldiers. He's got the support of most of a nation. This should be relatively straightforward for him to win. But that's not going to be what happens. He's got a beautiful head of hair, and that's the most important thing, right? Actually, the beautiful head of hair is going to become very relevant, right? Which is, I know why you're mentioning that. It's going to become relevant very shortly. So I want us to notice for a moment that the battle itself is not really described here. It's just sort of a passing note. And this must have been an epic battle. This is not the quick surgical strike that Ahithophel had recommended that Absalom make in trying to get rid of David quickly. This was something that took some planning. Armies were assembled. They were brought into battle. You've got thousands and thousands of men involved. If the small force that Ahithophel could muster up for his plan was 12,000, then how many do you think are available now when they can get all of Israel together? Surely a lot more. So there's a lot happening here, yet not a lot is mentioned. Because the focus of the story is not really on the battle, it's on what happens after the battle. And that's what we will spend the most time on as well. We see that 20,000 men die from Absalom's forces. That was verse 7. And this is a complete victory for David. Okay. So, how does Absalom die? Dave.
10 men surrounded him, struck him, swords obviously.
Yeah.
Big pit covered in rocks.
Yeah.
Like there's a connection. God is ironic so many times. He does things, he connects things. It was Absalom who took David's 10 concubines. I don't know if it has anything to do with anything, but it's kind of weird that he did that to the guys.
Yeah, there's, I don't know if that's coincidence or not either, but it's interesting. Mark.
Joab part of that is very interesting, that he's told that he's stuck in a tree. He says, well, why didn't you kill him? He asks the messenger, why didn't he? He says, because David said not to. So Joab runs over there and stabs him with some sticks or
Yeah.
spear or something.
Yeah. Yeah, so Absalom gets stuck in this tree, and it's it's almost comical the way this happens, right? It's meant to be this very humiliating death for Absalom, that he's riding on a mule, and that part's not supposed to be comical. The riding on a mule sounds comical to us. Mules were royal animals in that culture, so there's no comical element to that. That would have been him and all of his glory, as much as it's hard for us to attribute that to mules. Yet, as he passes under this tree, his hair gets caught in the branches, and he's left hanging. The mule goes on, and he's there just kind of feet kicking in the air. It's the most ridiculous scenario imaginable. The odds of this happening seem very unlikely to me, yet it's what happens. And so Absalom is stuck. There's nothing he can do. I can't even imagine what must be going through his head. And then, as we mentioned, we've got a few things that happen. One, a servant comes along, Absalom sees him there, runs and tells Joab, and as Mark said, Joab's response is, well, why didn't you kill him? And I do find it interesting that Joab found it so obvious that Absalom should be killed, and the servant found it so obvious that Absalom should not be killed, because they're looking at this from two very different perspectives. The servant has heard what David's orders were, and I'm not going to be the one to go against David's orders. Do you remember what David did to the last person who killed someone and thought David would be happy about it? David has never been one to enjoy that bloodshed, to, even from his enemies. When Saul was dead, there was no joy on David's part. And he certainly did not reward the person who claimed to kill Saul, even though he really didn't. That person was killed. So this servant has no desire to kill Absalom. Yet from Joab's perspective, why does Absalom need to die? Mark?
This is war.
Yeah.
He's a general.
Yeah.
And in the same way, he is ruthless. This guy will lure you in under false pretenses and stab you and cut you wide open.
Yeah.
This guy is ruthless. This
Yeah.
is just who he is. This is what he does.
Right.
He's a warrior.
Right.
This is what he does.
Absalom was a murderer, and he's a rebel. He's, all sorts of things here. Tamara?
Committed treason, he's a traitor.
Yeah. So Joab does not feel. Hi, Tamara, by the way. Joab does not feel like Absalom's life needs to be spared. That is not a question to him. Yet, obviously, we're going to see the conflict over this because Joab definitely wants him dead. Okay.
Well, what was David going to do with Absalom?
That's a good question.
And what is he going to do with him? He didn't really deserve to live.
No, he really doesn't. I'm inclined to read this as kind of more unwillingness to act, more of that inaction that we've seen from David in dealing with his sons. He's not been able to manage his sons very well. And I don't know what his plans are, so you can choose to read this more, more charitably or not, up to you. I know that David's pattern for a while in this account has been that he's unwilling or unable somehow to punish his sons, and feels like that maybe this is what he deserves. So what is he going to do with Absalom? I don't know. He clearly is not going to just let Absalom reign on the throne. David was willing to accept the possibility that this was God's judgment, but it didn't mean that he wasn't going to try to get the throne back. He is trying. He is willing to go into battle. He did not commit suicide or go run off to some foreign country and just leave Israel never to return. He is still going to try, and if it's God's will, then he will be successful. But what will he do with Absalom? I don't know. Maybe he hasn't thought that far. Maybe he intends to just banish Absalom, that worked so well last time, or imprison him or something. I don't know. I think Joab sees that there's not a lot of good answers here if Absalom stays alive. And so Joab, from a practical perspective, is probably correct here, that Absalom needs to die and deserves to die for treason against the Lord's anointed, but it's a sticky situation.
Was Joab around when Saul was after David?
I gotta think about that. Anybody remember that? Was Joab around when Saul was after King David?
Yeah, I believe so. He was contemporary with Abner.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because Abner was, right, since Abner was Saul's general at that time, Joab is still there with David and still kind of his right-hand man throughout that time. So, yes.
So maybe he didn't want to see the same thing repeated,
Yeah.
someone going after his
Yeah.
oil.
Yeah. Oh, for that reason, and probably for a lot of others, Joab's got a lot of loyalty toward David and wants what is best for David. Everything we've seen Joab do has been at least for what he thinks is in David's benefit. Whether it is or not, is questionable because, he doesn't always make the right choices, like we don't always make the right choices. But we don't see Joab act, maliciously against David anytime up to this point that I can remember. Lisa.
It's a little confusing. In verse 15, it says, when 10 young men who were Joab, armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him and killed him. So the three spears to the heart. Which is it?
Yeah.
Is it the three spears to the heart, or is it the armor bearers who struck him?
So I think this is that pattern that you see sometimes in Hebrew writing of a summary statement and then an explanation afterwards. The summary statement is Joab killed Absalom. The further explanation of it is first they humiliated Absalom by whacking him like a piñata, basically, and that's an image for you, and beating him there and wounding him, torturing him essentially, and then you kind of go back to your summary statement and see that it's Joab who makes the final blow and actually puts an end to this in killing Absalom. That pattern is something you see a fair amount in the Old Testament. That's confusing if you try to read it as if it's a chain of events, in chronological order. That's the best sense I can make of it, for sure. Dave?
There's more to it,
Mhm.
I think.
Okay.
And more important,
Yeah.
killing Absalom, is that when he buried him in that pit, it was just an unmarked grave. And the thing about that is that his troops all fled. There was no one to follow after him, praise him, didn't go worship him. Because I like put a pillar up like which Absalom did.
Yeah.
Put a pillar up for himself. That's why David was mourning so much, is that he had no one to see and none of that stuff.
Yeah.
This wasn't by accident that he put him in an unmarked grave.
Oh, no. No, not at all. Like, that was done to dishonor Absalom. And Absalom recognized the fact that he did not have a son to carry on his legacy and his name. And so we read that he had made this pillar, that is in verse 18. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. That's meant to be his legacy. And presumably that would have been a pretty good place for him to be buried. But that's not where he ends up getting buried, because he doesn't get to die in honor. He doesn't get to die as a triumphant king. He dies being treated like a piñata and killed by his father's general. Lisa.
Later on, when we have all the good and bad, good, evil kings, they're buried with their fathers.
Yeah.
That was extremely important to the culture, that they be buried with their fathers, with their fathers. They had a certain place that they were buried and honored them. Regardless
Yeah.
And so to remove this Absalom is a pretty huge insult and really putting him away from any honor and authority.
Yeah. And while at this point, Absalom probably would not want to be buried with his particular father, he still wants an honorable burial and an honorable death, as they all did then. And they very much cared what happened to their body after they died. There's a few times in Scripture we see some, dishonorable treatment of a body. Jezebel's body being thrown to the dogs in the street. That's not befitting a queen, right? Same for Absalom here. Whether he would be buried in, the tombs with his ancestors or buried in this place that he has created, either one of those would be good and honorable and kind of acceptable things for him to do. Being thrown into a pit and covered up is not that. And that's what Joab does to him. Clearly, Joab is angry at Absalom. And he has reason to be angry at Absalom. We're not ragging on Joab here, right? Absalom has done some horrible things throughout this. He has caused a lot of heartache. He's caused a lot of death. He's been a major problem and a traitor against the king. So this is probably what he deserves, but it's not the end that he saw. Karen.
Go back to Diane's question.
Mhm.
Back in Samuel 3 talks about Saul growing weaker, David growing stronger, and then it mentions all of David's children, boys. Don't know, of course, how old he was when he saw him, but it does mention it, Absalom and that time.
Okay, yeah.
Somehow he made him tell him what's going on.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. Okay, so Absalom is dead. How does David respond to that news and the news of the battle being won? He mourned. So there's a whole, thing that happens with messengers going to David. First one messenger who doesn't know the whole story, and then the second messenger. But by the time it all gets to David and he's told the news, the Cushite says that this is good news. Verse 31, good news for my lord the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. And David's only question is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. No, he is not well. He is dead, and may every enemy who rises up against you see the same fate that he did. And the Cushite thinks that this is good news to deliver to David. David does not accept any of this as good news, not even the victory. That is not something he's even able to process right now because Absalom is dead. That seems to be the only thing he cares about in this moment.
There's a lot of confusion about whether it was Absalom or the Cushite, because Ahimaaz wanted to go.
Yeah.
He wanted to go, and Joab said not today. And he sent the Cushite, which then it seems to say that he wanted to run. And Joab replied, my son, why do you want to run? You will get a reward. No matter what, I want to run. So then run, said Joab. So Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and out ran the Cushite. So was he the one that gave David the news?
He started to give the news. In verse 28, he tells him, Ahimaaz says, all is well, and blessed be the Lord your God who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. Basically, he can give the news that the battle is over and we won. In verse 29, David's only response, only question, like it is with the Cushite later, says, is it well with the young man Absalom? And Ahimaaz does not know, or says he does not know. Presumably he's left early enough that he does not yet know that Absalom is dead. So first that partial news is given to David, and then the Cushite arrives, and he has the complete story. However, since the Cushite left first, and he has the complete story, you would think that Ahimaaz then also would have it. That there's a little bit of confusion there of either somehow he does not know or he is unwilling to tell David that part of the news, that Absalom is dead, because he knows that David is not going to be pleased with that news. So all of this comes in kind of a jumbled way to David, adding to the confusion of the scene. But still, everyone expects, except maybe Joab. Joab seems to understand that this is not going to be taken as good news. People generally expect that David is going to celebrate. Why wouldn't he celebrate? The rebellion is over. And David and his men have won. David gets to be king again. There's peace in the land. Everything is good. And even better, the man who rebelled against you, he's dead. So he can't pose a threat to you any longer. David does not see this as good news. He mourns. And verse 33 says, the king was deeply moved, went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." All the "my sons" in that give you the idea of someone who is, uncontrollably mourning. Just the crying out of a parent who has lost a child. That's what that is. Not a king who quelled a rebellion, but a parent who lost a child. Dave.
There's a couple things, really. There's, not that I can see, there's no approach to God on David's part.
Yeah.
Who appoints kings? Who appointed Saul? Who appointed the Lord did?
Yeah.
Now he's saddened by his son's death, which is understandable.
Yeah.
But I have to say, and I'm speculating, but I think it's a good speculation, that he contributed to his son being the way he was.
Yeah.
Because, how he lived with the sheep and
Yeah.
all the stuff
Mhm.
he did. That wasn't God.
Yeah.
He had to have been a bad example for his son. Not blaming him for it, but his son did rebel. He did.
Yeah.
And took the kingdom, not God did not appoint Absalom.
Yeah.
And so maybe that contributed to that terrible big feeling of, I should have died instead of you.
Yeah.
Maybe he's blaming himself for that. It's certainly understandable.
Yeah.
Not that it's something he want to happen, but it's certainly understandable.
Yeah, I think that's the clearest way to understand the sequence of events here. What we've been leading up to this whole time is that it's David's sin and David's inaction that have contributed to Absalom spiraling, right? Everyone makes their own choices, and Absalom certainly makes his own here, and he's responsible for his own choices. But David bears some responsibility for the way that his son has turned out. He bears some responsibility for what happened to Tamar, for what happened to Amnon in being murdered. There's a lot that has happened here that David is at least indirectly responsible for. We don't need to pin all the blame on him, because that's not how this works, but we can pin at least some of it on him, because he is both the father and the king in this situation, and he's not really done well in either of those roles, at least in how it relates to his children. He's a very good king, probably the best king that Israel ever had, but when it comes to dealing with his children, he's not done that well. So the reason why he's mourning over Absalom is probably very complex, in that no parent wants to see their child dead, of course. Like, that's obvious. But also, it is more complicated than that, too. in that he feels some guilt. He feels some responsibility for Absalom turning out this way and all the what ifs. What if I had done this differently? What if I had restrained him earlier? What if I had not let it get this far? Mark?
When you read the Psalms, you understand David is still relying on God.
Yes.
He's relying on God to do what needs to be done, however that pans out.
Yep.
And, if one of my children wanted to have me killed or kill me,
Yeah.
I don't know that I would want to kill either one of them. I think
Yeah.
I would maybe call the cops and let somebody else take care of it.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever needed to happen. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the part that's thing to say. But that's what we're talking about, a very personal thing that has ramifications for an entire nation.
Yeah.
And ultimately, to the Christ that is going to come. And that is ultimately the story about what this is
Yes.
about, in my mind. And this is what David's having to deal with. I don't think he loses his faith.
No.
I think he's relying on God. He just doesn't want to be the guy, like with Saul.
Yeah.
He didn't want to kill Saul. He didn't want to do these things, but he
Yeah.
knew that God was going to have a hand in whatever happened.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think David has lost his faith here. We see him despondent. We see him dealing with a great deal of sorrow, certainly. And if we didn't have the Psalms, maybe we would have more questions, although there is no evidence that he's lost his faith in God. You would have to speculate even to get that far. But with the Psalms, I think we get so much that pairs with this to show that David is deeply relying on God. He feels some very strong emotions about this whole thing, which he's allowed to do, and that's very normal, very natural for him to feel. But he, the whole way, is relying on God and wants to be delivered by God, wants to be forgiven by God, and wants whatever is God's will to be done. And I think we saw that illustrated with how he left Jerusalem and didn't take the Ark of the Covenant with him, that he said, if it's God's will, then I will return to it and not take it with me as some talisman, things like that. He has not completely given up, but this has hurt him. This has definitely damaged David. That is where chapter 18 ends, with David mourning, and we are left in kind of an awkward situation because the people expect, and we're going to talk more about this in chapter 19, which we have time to do that. The people expect for David to be celebrating, to be happy, at least to be generally happy that this is over, and that's not the way that he reacts. So chapter 19, what is the effect of David's sorrow on the nation? Aaron?
It turns a great victory into a feeling of defeat. And
Yeah.
What was the point? Why did we do this?
Yeah. I think you've got an element of confusion here. You've got this despair and sorrow that's overtaking everyone. When they see, our king is not happy. He's not celebrating. So why did we do this? Is he broken? Is he irreparable at this point? What do we even do? Where do we go forward with this? What should have happened here instead of this? Was David, did he not even want to become king again? This is all very confusing. Lisa?
Very demoralizing
Yeah.
to have something that you feel, and it was the correct outcome. But then to see, difficult as the whole thing was, to see that David had, felt like David had no appreciation for what had happened, and then,
Yeah.
that they essentially maybe done the wrong thing.
Right. Yeah. Then you start feeling bad about your own, joy and celebration, right? Because your king's not happy. So this is all getting to be a mess. And you've got this state of limbo where nobody quite knows where to go from here. Mark?
I see
Right.
This points to the Christ, a man who's willing to look beyond the obviousness of so many things and deal with what needs to happen, what needs to be dealt with. And this is absolutely righteous in my eyes. David takes care of all of these things, and then we see later that things become better all of a sudden. Well,
Yeah.
they're going to be better because God is taking care of this.
Yeah, so Joab is looking at this from a pragmatic point of view, right? What Joab is concerned with is making sure that the kingdom runs smoothly and that all is well for David as king. David has his personal grief over this, but Joab has some concerns about what that's going to mean if he cannot pull himself together quick enough. Dave?
Well, I disagree with Mark you said at all. However, this is getting, from the standpoint of Joab, I can see he's getting selfish about the morning. It's just going on and on and on. And it's almost like he's trying to, in his mind, David, goes all being wrongdoing with Absalom. And by doing that, he's disgracing all the people that stood by him to help him.
Yeah.
And so that's something that we have to take into consideration because
Right.
it says so.
And that's Joab's argument here, that, like, look at the bravery of your men who fought for you. You're kind of dishonoring them by not, taking joy in this victory. Think of all the people's lives who were saved by quelling this rebellion. If we had lost, then Absalom would have killed all of us. And you have the audacity to mourn over this? He would not have spared you. He would not have been sad to see you go. Now, to Mark's point, and I think this is fair, right? David is a whole person. He is not just a king. And sometimes with people in positions of power, like, we do make the mistake of forgetting that they are people too. They are allowed to have emotions. They are allowed to have their own personal struggles with things. But Joab's not altogether wrong here. From a pragmatic point of view, he needs to pull himself together, or, as Joab says, you're going to lose the people. They will not follow you if this pattern continues. So you've got to be careful. You've got to pull yourself together. And kind of what goes unsaid here, but I think is at least implied, is you can mourn if you need to mourn, but you got to do it in private. You've got to put on a public face of celebration and joy at this victory, and not allow morale to dip any lower. And that's the pragmatic stance for David as king. Mark?
I just think we see the providence of God here.
Yeah.
And it's just, really, all these things had to happen the way they happened. And it's really this lamenting over the consequence of sin.
Yes.
And that, for me, that's the overriding message. It's the consequence of sin, and it just wrecks people's lives.
Yeah, it does. A couple of you have brought up today that, David is, a shadow of Christ in this, and that's very much to be seen. All of the imperfections of David are resolved and made perfect in Jesus, of course. Jesus doesn't share any of the flaws that David has. And it is noteworthy that as much as I think it is indisputable that David is the best king that Israel ever had, he is far from perfect. And we've seen too many things that he's done that are far from perfect. And that leads to a lot of questions. When you guys go on into, Kings and Chronicles, right, and you see the kings that come after, and you see that nobody really lives up to the legacy that David offered, this question for Israel, starts looming larger and larger. Of, how are we supposed to, be everything God wants us to be when our kings are so bad, when the people are so bad, when really this is, one of the high points, maybe the high point in the history of Israel. And while it is kind of a bumpy path down, it is a path down from here. There's some cases, some argument for Solomon's reign being an escalation in some things. It's the largest, borders that Israel has for like economic control and things like that. Probably the richest that the nation has been. There's a lot that's good about Solomon's reign too, but things do start to decline. So we've got a lot of questions that come up with, what is this fate of Israel when no king can even be as good as David, and even David is not without his flaws. Of course, Jesus sets all that to rest. Darren?
Yeah, leadership is extremely difficult.
Yeah.
David's in a pretty difficult place. It was right for him to mourn. Also, I think David is, again, we see an extreme example of his humility.
Yes.
Look at Joab, and how valuable is it to have someone that can speak to you in that way? If you're in a position of power as a king,
Yeah.
and to have the heart of David to be able to hear that and recognize the truth in
Yeah.
what Joab is saying. He had to mourn. It was right for him to mourn, and it was also right for him to show his face to the people and show his thanks
Yeah.
to the soldiers and all the people that showed up to support him,
Yeah.
and to carry out God's plan
Yeah.
for him. He had to do both of those things. It wasn't one or the other.
Right.
But for David to hear that in his grief and to have the humility to recognize that Joab is speaking the truth to him, and what a valuable asset that is to have a friend like that for someone in that position.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I'm glad. Thank you for bringing that up. That David has shown himself to be someone who can hear advice, take advice, given by people who necessarily are under him. Right? He's king. He's on top, and a lot of kings are not able to figure out how to take advice, good advice like that, to surround themselves with people who can offer that, that wise counsel, and use that to make themselves a better king. Of course, we're going to see a bunch of examples of that, of kings with poor advisors. Rehoboam definitely does that coming forward. Okay, next week we will continue on in chapter 19 with kind of the more like macro concerns here in the nation. Just because the rebellion has been quelled does not mean that everything is resolved. David's got to do some things to try to unify the nation. Thank you.